So, yes, this is a different kind of movie than we've had recently. After watching several in a row about war and revolution, this is a smaller story, but not an insignificant one when we're looking at world history and just kind of the flow of ideas over time. So, my first thought, I had seen this movie before, and I guess I had forgotten that it was a fictionalized account where they had changed all the names. And my first question was, well, why did they do that? And it seems to be basically so they could more guilt-free make it a more interesting movie because real life was not near as exciting as this movie makes the event out to be.
Yeah, because well, we can get into it. I mean, like there's some pretty major differences between the trial in the movie and the trial in real life. Not necessarily the differences that you would think, though.
Right.
Like the defendant in the movie, he's like an innocent teacher who like gets arrested and is like, oh my gosh, why is this happening? Oh, you guys are arresting me for. And in real life, the ACLU put out newspaper ads like, hey, we want to challenge this law in Tennessee. Who wants to come be a defendant for us? And this guy basically like signed up, or they talked him into it. They were like, oh, hey, you want to be a defendant for this trial? We want to challenge this law. And his motivation was as much, oh, yeah, I want to challenge this law because I believe in evolution. I think, free speech is important. But also he was like, well, I also want to bring, all this publicity and stuff to my town because it's 1925 and the Great Depression, or the economy in his town was bad. I guess it wasn't the Great Depression yet, but
yes, and so the movie almost makes it seem like the spectacle was incidental to this event happening anyway. The spectacle was the goal in reality,
right.
And to the point that like the real guy, the actual John Scopes, didn't even specifically remember whether or not he had taught evolution in class. But said,
yes,
if you want to say I did and charge me with it, I'll gladly go to trial for you guys. It was all just part of this show, which I actually was a little confused by. Was the reason that they were wanting the publicity just to boost the economy?
I think it was a major reason, yeah. And you even see that a little bit in the movie. Obviously, it's toned down and downplayed a little bit. But when they're having the meeting, like with the mayor and the prosecutors, I think is before the famous prosecutor signs on to the case. But they're saying, oh, they're debating whether they should have a trial or not. And he said, well, if we have this trial, it'll be a really big deal. And everybody who wants to come see the trial is gonna need a place to stay. They're gonna need a place to eat, and then inevitably, like the very first day that the prosecutor shows up and starts making his speeches, you have the guys selling hot dogs and the guys selling Bibles, and that's all the way through the movie. Like at the end of the movie, as soon as the trial's over, that guy comes in and is trying to sell Eskimo pies to everybody in the courtroom.
Oh, that's right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah. So let me give a brief overview of the movie, actually really quick, and then we'll kind of go more into detail with it and how it compares to what happened in real life, because I'd rather focus more on the real life figures in the movie than their proxies.
Sure.
So yes, the teacher is arrested for teaching evolution, and then there's a trial, and it gets national attention immediately, and they kind of hint within the movie that it's kind of making the town a little bit of a laughing stock, that this is mostly a settled thing across the country, but they bring in a prominent lawyer for the defense, and then we have Gene Kelly plays a reporter from Baltimore, and his paper is helping to fund the defense, and even like puts up, I think, his bail at one point. And then we see the trial, and it's basically just kind of the debates and, a little bit of the character stuff. And it's a good movie. It's very interesting and definitely worth watching, and kind of just highlights the debate in a way that was fairly reflective of the debate they were having in the courtroom. But a lot of the things were definitely different. And kind of to your point, with the teacher kind of volunteering to take one for the ACLU team here. In the movie, they have him arrested and basically in jail during the trial, and has this fiance who's the daughter of a local pastor. Well, the fiance and her father are fictitious. The actual Scopes was not incarcerated during the trial at all. I kind of saw conflicting sources here. He may have been tokenly arrested, but was never actually held in custody. And then so the prominent lawyer, and this is the name, so I've heard of Scopes, although I didn't remember his first name. And then This is a name I'd heard of, but I couldn't remember what context I really had heard it in. William Jennings Bryan, the politician from Nebraska, and he was the lawyer, in reality, brought in for the prosecution. It was just kind of a token thing. He was a big-time Democratic politician. He had actually been their party's nominee for president 3 times, which has never happened today, because it's like we have this idea today that once you lose, you're just kind of tainted and we don't want you to be it again. But in, what was it, 1896, 1900, and 1908 were those the 3 years? And then he kind of, not necessarily fell out of favor, but just, they picked someone else in 04, and then he came back in 08. But he lost all 3 of those elections.
Well, I mean, he did a lot of stuff throughout his political career. He was the Secretary of State during World War I. Which is kind of like
that's the big one. Right. Yeah, because after he lost all those, then they actually win in 12 with Woodrow Wilson, and he, because of his contributions in history with the party, he was definitely a prominent member of the cabinet and all that during the war. So in 1896, when he was the Democratic nominee for president, he was only 36 years old, so that's the youngest ever nominee over the 2 major parties, when it comes down to, the last 2, where that's their chosen candidate, and it's a record that still stands. So everyone, right now is talking about how 37-year-old Pete Buttigieg is just crazy young. Well, if he ultimately got the nomination, he would not even break the record for youngest Democratic nominee for president, which I thought was kind of interesting. Right. And then when they bring him in to be the prosecuting attorney for the trial, he hadn't prosecuted a case in over 30 years. It was very much a token thing, and this was an issue he felt passionately about. William Jennings Bryan was a fundamentalist who, in the movie and in real life, has a very strict kind of letter for letter interpretation of the Bible, and believes that the teaching of evolution is in conflict with that, and then a community should have the right to set, basically the parameters of what's allowed to be taught in their schools. And then kind of tying that back into the case itself and Scopes volunteering to go on trial, they don't mention in the movie how basically the law had gone into effect 6 weeks before he was charged with violating it. So this was all very much, the moment the Butler Act, I think it was called, got passed.
Yeah.
The ACLU says, all right, what do we need to do to publicly challenge this and kind of put our foot down, because we feel this violates the First Amendment. And, of course, separation of church and state, which the movie doesn't really specifically go into. It kind of attacks it from other issues. And in real life, too, it didn't seem like that was the way they were approaching this. Although I think that's, the only way I see it.
Well, and that's, in the end, that's actually how that law was defeated, I guess, is because the Supreme Court ruled that it violated the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment.
But that was 40 years later, right?
Right. Yes.
Right. So yeah, again, kind of jumping to the end. So ultimately, Scopes lost the trial, and in the movie, his proxy loses the case. He is convicted of violating it.
Well, and the point I think in the movie doesn't really hold with the actual goal of the case. The goal of the case was never to win.
True.
In the movie, it is. Like, they are actually legitimately trying to win. In real life,
they almost were wanting an appeal, right?
Right. Well, they wanted to just get this law into the courts so that then they could appeal it and try and get it to a higher court who could maybe strike down the entire law altogether.
Right. It was never about Scopes, right?
Right. And then the other thing is that this was one of the first, if not the first, trial to be broadcast over the radio.
Yes, I think it was the first. Yeah.
And so Clarence Darrow basically used that as an opportunity to try the law in the courtroom, but also in the public as well, because he knew that everyone around the country was going to be listening to it, so it wasn't really important whether they won or not. And in fact, they knew they weren't going to win, and that wasn't the goal, but they wanted to kind of get the word out.
Right. At the end of the day, he violated the statute, and even the defense couldn't argue against that. There was this statute, he violated it, so for the jury, it was just an open and shut case. And in the movie, the judge is a little biased, but it actually sounds like in reality he was even more biased and basically instructed the jury to find him guilty, like all but saying it. And so the jury even kind of felt like their hands were tied and like, well, yeah, within the scope of what we were asked to do, we have no choice but to say guilty. But
right.
The jury, I think, kind of felt that it was maybe even an unjust law.
Right. The judge who in the movie is Harry Morgan, who's Colonel Potter from MASH.
Yes, I had to look. I was like, oh, he looks so familiar. But of course, he's a little younger here, and I never actually watched a lot of MASH, but I did recognize him for sure. Well, yeah, of course. So Spencer Tracy plays Darrow, Gene Kelly as the reporter, who that character way too smug to ever win anybody to his side. And I feel like, especially when I think that's relevant though too. You talk about, politics today, and they basically say the worst thing you can do to ever try to win someone over and actually get them to change their opinion on a fundamental belief is ridicule them. They will just shut down and double down on their beliefs and stop listening to you. So I found him kind of amusing, but at the same time, that's because I believed or I agreed with him.
Right.
If I had been on the other side, I'd been like, screw this guy, and just dismissed him. So he was entertaining, but man, you kind of wanted to slap him even though I agreed with him. Let's see. Man, that's really all there is to the movie, isn't there?
So the scene where I'll just refer to them by their names in real life because I don't remember the character names, but where Darrow gets William Jennings Bryan on the stand, so that basically the defense calls the counsel for the prosecution to the stand as a witness. That was one of the things that I was like, I didn't know anything about the Scopes Monkey trial before, other than just the name before watching the movie. But that was something I was like, okay, surely this is dramatized for the movie, but it's not. That actually happened in real life. I guess the line of questioning is actually pretty close to how he actually went about the questioning in the movie, where he's asking him the questions like, oh, well, where did Cain's wife come from? And how long were the days of creation? And then as soon as he got William Jennings Bryan just to admit like that he didn't know like a couple things, and that, oh, so you don't take the Bible as literally. And then he just slaughtered him on the stand, basically. And that was huge in the eyes of the public who were listening over the radio, listening to Darrow just eviscerate William Jennings Bryan on the stand. Like, once he got him to admit one thing, he just went all out.
Yes, and it does look like that's maybe one of the instances where real life might have actually been as good or better than what we got in the movie. It says in real life, they basically went back and forth for 2 hours on the stand, to the point that they actually agreed that they would flip. And the next day, it would be roles reversed. And Bryan would get to actually question Darrow. And the judge basically just put a stop to it and said, like, okay, this is just too much theater for me. You guys just need to cut it out. And I'm going to cut you off now and not let you go the other way with it. The part I remember, too, from the film is where he talks about, well, what about a sponge? Does a sponge have, does a sponge think? And he's like, well, if God wants a sponge to think, a sponge will think. And he's like, thank you. So maybe Scopes should be allowed to think for himself as well. And it's like, Oh, that was kind of like the mic drop moment there.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting too. So like in the movie, so he gets really flustered, and again, Scopes loses. He's fined a nominal $100, which I saw would be equivalent of about $1,400 a day. So not nothing, but no jail time, no anything. It was all just kind of a token thing. Then, as the courtroom is clearing, Jennings Bryan is all flustered and still trying to give his prepared closing statement, and then they just have him die of a heart attack right there in the courtroom in the film.
Yeah, in the movie, and this is where it kind of like blends real life and a fictional story, because in real life, just like in the movie, the defense, Clarence Darrow, he declines to give a closing statement because he knows, number one, he knew that the jury wasn't going to listen to him anyway, but he also knew that William Jennings Bryan was going to use that opportunity to make a very long and preachy closing statement. So he just said, well, I'm not going to make a closing statement. And he knew that by Tennessee law, that meant that William Jennings Bryan was also not allowed to give a closing statement.
Okay.
So just like in the movie, he declines to give a closing statement, so the judge doesn't allow William Jennings Bryan to give his closing statement. But then in the movie, William Jennings Bryan's character then grabs the radio microphone and tries to give his speech over the radio, and then dies of a heart attack right there in the courtroom. Which that's fictionalized, but he did actually die right after the trial was over.
5 days,
5 or 6 days later.
I was actually sad to read that. I'm like, oh my gosh, he really did die right after the trial. They say it's kind of still kind of debated what, to what extent the trial kind of, triggered the end of his life. And I would say man, it's the stress of it, even in real life. It'd be hard to argue that it didn't contribute to it in my mind, because he's only in his 60s, right? So he's just 65 years old. So man, that's That's I don't know. I kind of felt bad for the guy after that, even though and again, the movie doesn't make him the villain per se. The movie definitely has its point of view, and you are definitely on the side of or put on the side of the evolutionists.
I really like, though, that they made them, and I don't know if this is true, but they talk about how the Clarence Darrow character and the William Jennings Bryan character, like, so it shows that, like, they're old friends and they do agree on a lot, but this is one area where they don't agree, and that's kind of where the conflict comes from. But they're not like, it's not like a partisan, something like that you would expect to see today, where you have one person who falls, on this issue, or on all these issues, they fall on one side, and on the other person, like, every single issue there.
That is kind of frustrating with today's political climate, where it kind of just, I think we probably talked about this before, where I still feel like most people are in the middle, or they're kind of center left to center right. But then the way the media and everybody else kind of presents things, you're kind of forced to pick, I don't think extreme right or extreme left. I still think there's very few people that are actually there, despite how each side paints the other as being in the extreme. But you're kind of forced to check off all the boxes on the left or all the boxes on the right, regardless of the issue. And it's like just ridiculous that why would, 20 completely disparate topics all have one answer for one group of people and then another answer for another group of people without having a lot of crossover? And
right.
That's kind of ridiculous. And yeah, to your point, well, yeah, it wasn't always that way.
And William Jennings Bryan is a really good example of this, because, you would think, oh, well, if he was like this, this really staunch religious guy who wanted to teach evolution in schools, surely he's, a conservative. But he wasn't. I mean, he ran for president as a Democrat, and he was, all about pushing for the 8-hour day and the 40-hour work week. And he was a proponent of the government making sure that all of its citizens can earn a living wage, women's suffrage. I mean, he was...
Oh, interesting, right.
He was on social issues, he was a pretty, well, I guess with the notable exception of wanting to teach evolution or wanting to teach creation in schools, on pretty much every other social issue, he was like a progressive, and a pretty hardcore progressive even for the time.
Yes, and we should know, for those who don't necessarily follow, that like you would not recognize not just the whole different people having kind of different opinions on different issues regardless of what their party affiliation is. You would not recognize the Democratic Party or Republican Party from 100 years ago today. It's just the platforms are just completely unrecognizable. I mean, it's just and you can't even. It's not even as simple as, oh, okay, well, the South was all Democrats and now it's all Republicans. It's like, yeah. But even that is just the tip of the iceberg of how things have shifted. If you look, because we're kind of used to what the presidential map looks like. Okay, these are your red states, these are your blue states, and these are your swing states. Blah 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 blah. But you go back just 30 years, and that's not how it was. And then you start looking back. Look at all the maps.
Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were from California.
Oh, right.
Like they were, Ronald Reagan was one of the most conservative presidents we've ever had, and also was the governor of California.
Right. Because I think that California was actually maybe even mostly a red state then. But then, of course, you had but the whole South was blue. So it's like, yeah, and that's not. We don't have time to even just go in, and I'm not an expert on it either. But it's changed a lot, and yeah, that's kind of all we need to say on that. So. Darrow. So a little bit on Darrow. So he was just kind of a famous lawyer. Yes, and just kind of an activist and a progressive who I think had ran for some offices, was just kind of a successful lawyer, and just kind of I hate to call him an agitator, but just someone who was very active in doing what he felt was right and was good at advocating for those things. So, definitely a member of the ACLU, one of the leaders there. And I wanted to mention, another case that he was famous for. Did you see this? The Leopold and Leb thing, or how do you say that? Yeah, I don't know if it's Loeb or Leb or Loeb. Yeah. But yeah, it's a murder trial, which I think they reference in the movie. They call it something different, but the William Jennings Bryan character brings up, you're just going to talk to the jury like in the whatever trial. I don't remember the name they give it. I don't think he actually says Leopold and Loeb, but he says, oh yeah, you're just going to twist their minds, which a lot of people, they didn't really like the way that Clarence Darrow handled it, because he was the defense attorney for two
murderers who kidnapped and murdered a 14-year-old boy in Chicago. And basically his whole thing was he didn't want them to get the death penalty. So he knew they were guilty, it looks like. Yeah. Right. They had both confessed, and it was definitely them. But he just basically used the trial to talk to the jury about, the capital punishment is, it's trying to get revenge. It doesn't have any value in a modern society. And that was kind of like the way that he was coming at it, was trying to get them to not be executed. And he was successful. And a lot of people really didn't like him for that, even though they were going to die in prison no matter what. And actually one of them got paroled.
He got paroled, yeah.
And then died later. The other one was stabbed to death. 58 said cause of death, 58 inflicted wounds from a razor attack.
Yeah. But I thought that case was interesting, though, because it's basically, two college guys who just thought they were so smart that they wanted to see if they could get away with murder. Or they were that confident they could get away with murder. So basically they killed a kid just to get away with it, and were unsuccessful. We're just like, oh my gosh, what psychopaths? It's almost kind of like one of those, a case today where they would have pleaded like affluenza, where they didn't know what they were doing was actually wrong. But anyway, kind of a gross case there, and they talk about it being kind of the inspiration for other stories, because we've kind of heard of that idea where basically you got the psychopaths that are trying to, how could we get away with murder? And then these guys did it in real life, and it kind of inspired some other works of fiction there.
And of course, they're not as smart as they think they are. I mean, they didn't even have DNA back then. These guys couldn't get away with murder. They had DNA, they just couldn't.
Forensics. Yes. Yeah, they did have DNA. They weren't made of plastic, but
right, yeah. But I think one of the the big things is one of them dropped their glasses. And he had this hinge mechanism on his glasses, and he was one of it was a custom frame or something. And he's one of 3 people in Chicago that had bought this specific kind of hinge mechanism on his glasses. It's what an idiot. Why would you even take those to the murder that you're going to do? Not to get off the rails.
I did think it was interesting. This is just a little bit of trivia here. The defense actually asked novelist H.G. Wells if he would come and speak for the defense. But he was like...
Was he too busy chasing Jack the Ripper, or...?
Most likely. No, this was 1925, so he was happily married with his wife from San Francisco.
That's true.
From the future. Yeah. So, but no, he was basically just no, thanks. And so let's actually kind of then spend the last little bit of this talking more broadly about this kind of issue. And we can try to stay fairly, in the center as far as, and just kind of speak of this intellectually without getting too much into our personal opinions. So religion and politics specifically. So aside from this, is something, to my understanding, was always kind of meant to be relegated to just your personal beliefs. And faith has its place, but not necessarily in influencing public policy.
Right. Well, and even in your personal life, I don't think that your faith and your belief in your scientific beliefs necessarily have to clash with each other. One is your views on what is natural, science, and the other is your views on what is supernatural. So they don't necessarily have to conflict with each other.
Right, because they're in different realms. They're right; they're in different realms, and I guess, and right. I think that's part of the frustrating part. So yes, this movie is dealing specifically with evolution, but I think he mentions in the film, well, we're not. Why aren't we dealing with heliocentrism and Galileo and stuff? It's basically the church challenged that too, despite science having evidence and church just not wanting to alter their existing structure. And that does end up being my issue with all of this, whether it's an issue we have today or back then, is I feel like all too often the fundamentalist side of this argument starts with the answer they want and then works from there to justify it, versus science is approaching with questions.
Right, and that's not what science is. You don't start from a conclusion and then cherry pick facts that support that.
Right. Despite some people, saying, some people claiming that's what science does, I think it's just because their science is finding answers that are contrary to their pre-decided beliefs. And again, I think there are times where then science can hold on to ideas too long after, maybe a new idea does come in, they reject it out of hand when, evidence does change. Anyway, so yeah, it is all kind of frustrating. And for me, I think, I always have thought that, the separation of church and state is very important. And what the movie doesn't get into specifically, it always comes back to, this idea of freedom in the United States. And yes, you have the freedom to believe whatever you want to believe, to hold whatever faith you want to hold. But the public and other citizens have the freedom from your faith affecting their lives. And even if it's a 90% to 10% thing, so if a community is 95% all one faith, that 5% still has the right not to have the 95%'s beliefs forced onto them.
Right. And when it comes to public policy, you don't make public policy based on your religion. You make public policy based on the best information available. And if you have 99.9% of biologists or archaeologists, geologists saying your account of how the universe and the world came into being is not accurate based on all of this scientific evidence, maybe we're not going to teach that in schools anymore. We're going to teach all of this scientific evidence.
Right. It's the difference between academics and spirituality, and we're kind of talking in circles here, but there's not meant to be an overlap. And I guess maybe there's some inevitable contradictions, but
there's also plenty of biologists and scientists who are Christian or Jewish or Muslim. Like, they also hold their religious faith as well. It doesn't necessarily have to conflict.
Einstein in particular was very strong in his faith, right?
Yeah. Well, and even on the flip side, there's plenty of people who would self-describe as an atheist who think that the world is flat.
That is true
so
as well.
Just because you are just because your spiritual views point one way doesn't mean that your scientific views are going to point a certain way.
Correct. So yes, I always just come down to just keep an open mind, keep asking questions, and be excellent to each other to bring Bill and Ted's back into all of this.
Exactly. If listeners want to learn more, maybe not necessarily learn more, but have the Scopes Monkey Trial presented in a funnier way, they could check out the Drunk History episode that deals with the Scopes Monkey Trial with Jack McBrayer as Clarence Darrow and Bradley Whitford as William Jennings Bryan. It's hilarious.
I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, I think if you go on YouTube and just type in Scopes Monkey Trial, I think it's actually the first video.
Without adding the Drunk History part.
Exactly. Yes.
The ACLU was only established about 5 years before this, and as I mentioned on the episode about Helen Keller, she was one of the founding members of the ACLU. Let's talk about it briefly. So today, the ACLU is seen as having a liberal bias. Now, the liberal in me would say that's because the truth has a liberal bias, but but the operational, philosophy of the ACLU is to defend the Bill of Rights. So we have, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the ACLU is a nonprofit organization that advocates for those. And I would say, in fairness, that I think the reason it has a liberal bias is because it doesn't necessarily advocate as passionately for the Second Amendment as it does for the others. Not that it's against the Second Amendment. It does include, I think, that as part of its purview. But you can argue that the Second Amendment has its whole other thing advocating for it and doesn't need the ACLU's help. And I don't think ACLU has ever advocated against, the Second Amendment. They just kind of tend to focus on, First Amendment specifically. It tends to be the one I think they fight for. But then, there would definitely be others that I'm sure that would come up, but not that I can name all 10. But yes, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom from religion. If someone wants to put up the 10 Commandments, on a public building, the ACLU might step in. Of course, then you also have today the Freedom from Religion Foundation that kind of focuses specifically on those kinds of things. And again, I have no problem with people believing whatever they want to believe or holding whatever faith, but once you're proselytizing on the public dime, that's inappropriate. It's just fundamentally inappropriate to, I think, what this country was built on. And it's, you have the freedom of expression and the freedom of religion, and everyone else has the freedom from your religion and the right to their own beliefs without public money being used to influence them. So when public money is being used for a nativity scene, well, why can't that public money be used for, I'd say, a picture of Muhammad, but you can't have pictures of Muhammad. But you know what I'm saying.
Right. Or they say, well, if you're going to spend you're going to spend public money on a nativity scene or a Ten Commandments section of your courthouse, then maybe to be fair, you should also spend some of that money to allow judges to marry same-sex couples. It's that kind of
give and take.
That's probably a bad example because they're not equivocating. Like they're not saying, oh, well, we can have it, both ways. They're saying, no, religion, maybe keep that out of government. But then they're also pro-gay rights, LGBT, rights in general, trans rights.
Within the context of the Bill of Rights, though. I mean, because if these freedoms are being denied,
Yes, right. They a lot of times court cases involving discrimination against women, against LGBT people, against minorities, usually the ACLU supports them, provides them lawyers directly.
Right, which goes back to equal protection under the law, which is what, the 14th Amendment, if I'm guessing off the top of my head. Yes, anyway, tune back in next week, and we will be going over to Germany in the Weimar Republic, that interstitial period between World War I and World War II in Germany, with the 1972 Best Picture nominee, Cabaret, starring Liza Minnelli and Michael York.